Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb and I am the producer of this show. Unfortunately, I'm not joining you for this episode. This is a special episode that was recorded during the summer between Dr. Francisco and Dr. Keith. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to give you a little announcement and then I'm going to let the show fade in. We are 1 week away from Here We Still Stand. We changed up the schedule a little bit. This week was supposed to be an episode on reason and faith and reason, but I wanted to get this last summer episode in here before Here We Still Stand starts next week. Then next week on Friday, the Faith and Reason episode will launch. The Thursday before that, during the conference, we will be recording a live episode of the Thinking Fellows. If you're at the conference, you'll be able to join us, which will be a lot of fun, and you'll get to meet the fellows and sit in on that live show. The following week, which is the week before Reformation Day, that episode, the episode that we recorded at Here We Still Stand, will go up. So if you missed it, if you weren't at the conference, that's your time to download it. If you were at the conference and you were paying attention to what was going on and not necessarily the entirety of the show, you'll be able to go re-listen to it and all that jazz. I also will have show notes available for that episode on the website per usual. One of the other things that we're doing lately is a newsletter. So I'm trying to make sure that a weekly newsletter for the show goes out. What is in that newsletter is a link to the episode on our website, as well as links to various podcasting apps or services where you can access our show. Also in that newsletter is the comprehensive show notes. So if you would like to get the show notes to your inbox every Friday, that's one way to do that. This also might help you find a podcasting app if you're still looking for one to subscribe to. And if you are missing out on the show because you like to listen on the web or you use our website, but you kind of miss some Fridays because you're not a subscriber, subscribing to the newsletter is the next best thing. So in order to do that, you can go to our website and there's a contact page, and you can either contact me to subscribe, or sometimes if it's your first time going to the website this month, a pop-up for subscribing to the newsletter will show up. You can also subscribe on our Facebook page. So there's a subscribe button on the Thinking Fellows Facebook page. And like I said, if you do that, what you'll get is a weekly Thinking Fellows email, and then the rest of the monthly 1517 Legacy Project emails. And that includes one monthly newsletter, and then usually one or two sales announcements from our store where you can get a code or an alert that there are certain books or other products in the 1517 Legacy shop that are on sale. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode. Please remember that we are donor funded, so this isn't a for-profit show. We don't have, right now, and I'd like to keep it this way as long as possible, ads in the show that are from outside 1517 that are paid ads. And so the entire content of the show, the ability to put this together every week, is brought about by a handful of great donors, and we really appreciate that. If you want to fund the show, if you want to help the show, you can contact me at caleb@1517legacy.com. Thank you once again, and enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows. This is not Caleb, this is Scott Keith. It is summertime here in California and everywhere else, I guess, in the Northern Hemisphere. And our schedules are quite packed, and we're trying to fill episodes as we can. And just so happens today that the only two people that were available to podcast were Dr. Adam Francisco and myself. So hello, Adam.
Good morning, or afternoon.
Afternoon-ish.
Good morning.
What are you looking at on your phone there? Do you want to tell me?
I'll use ambiguous language, an upper receiver.
Oh,
That's
all
all I'll say
right.
about that.
All right. Today, following our Reformation series here, we thought, since it's just Adam and I always love giving Adam topics that he can, as our friends say, riff on. Right, Adam?
That's right. Riff is...
Yeah. That we would talk about the Reformation and Islam. That's basically what Adam will be talking about at the Here We Still Stand conference. And since most of the series we're in right now is giving you a little preview of that conference, I thought maybe I'd give Adam the opportunity to do that today. So here we are. And Adam, I know you've done the the episode on Thinking Fellows Lutheran Islam, right?
Yeah, what was that, almost a year ago?
Yeah, that was at least a year ago.
I think it was one of those times where we were looking for a topic that we could do.
Like this?
Yeah.
Probably last summer?
Yeah. But I think it went, if I remember correctly, I wasn't, I'm never happy with anything I do, but I think we didn't get through everything that I wanted to get through, because there's some really significant, interesting stuff in the Reformation period that gets overlooked when it comes to the challenge that the Ottoman Empire out of Istanbul posed to Reformation Europe, or just Europe.
Right, yeah.
And every major reformer and Renaissance thinker or humanist is in some way aware of Islam, interested in coming to grips with what Islam teaches. In one case, in Switzerland, a guy named Theodor Bibliander, a humanist but reformer in the Zwinglian strain, in the 1540s, was putting together a translation, a new edition of an old translation of the Quran. And this is 1543 in the city of Basel, and it got the publisher, a guy named Johannes Operinus, or John Operinus, thrown in jail, which is interesting because
for publishing a new translation of the
for wanting to publish or typesetting a heretical book, which is Basel at that time is probably the most liberal in terms of like free city in Western Europe. But the Quran was seen as such not just a heretical book, but a dangerous book, because if you read it, you might find yourself tempted into a Unitarianism or Islam, as was the case with Michael Servetus, over in Geneva, where he's beheaded.
Sure.
I think he was beheaded. Was he beheaded?
I think he was, yeah. So let's back up just for a second. I mean, one of the things that we're talking about here is the fact that we oftentimes look at this era, especially those of us who are interested in the Reformation, and the things that happened during this era as only a theological movement. We tend to see it rather one-sidedly, right? Especially
one-sidedly, and almost. This is the historian's criticism of the way theologians tend to approach the Reformation. It's almost like everything's abstracted from a historical context, and it gets almost what a political historian would say, or a political scientist. It almost gets ideological.
Right. I ran into that even in my studies on Melanchthon, where I think it's pretty easy to say that most conservative Lutheran theologians, their view of Melanchthon doesn't take into account the historical circumstances in which he found himself, i.e. being thrust into the role of an ambassador, his role during the interims, and he was really the only one left, and really trying to protect lives by making concessions and things like those are abstracted out, and all that's focused on is, he made concessions here, he was conciliarist here, without understanding all the things that were being thrust upon him.
I mean, I get the theologians wanting, when they look back at history, I get wanting to figure out, who's Orthodox, who's heterodox, who's heretic. I mean, I kind of get that, but that's a real weird way of doing history.
Right.
It's and this is not a positive or a title, but it's a confessionalist approach to historiography, and that's another way of saying an ideological approach. And it's if you look at, say, since we're going to be talking about Islam in a bit, if you read Islamic authors, Sayyid Qutb, for example, 20th century guy who in many ways was the ideological giant for the Muslim Brotherhood and most of what we call Islamism, or the more extreme view of Islam today. He's got a piece in one of his works, actually several of his works, on Luther and the Reformation. And he looks back at European history and talks about the Middle Ages being such a dark period because of scholastic theology, Trinitarian theology is evolving, and all these other things. And he says, and then we get to the Reformation, where Luther and Calvin set the church back on course such that it's not completely in line with, but is en route to becoming in line with Islam.
Oh, wow.
And he even calls Luther a Unitarian.
Oh, wow.
So he's got this sort of Islamic framework,
yeah.
and he's imposing that on the facts on the ground or the context. And I'm sorry, listeners, if this offends you, but that's a really bad way of doing history. Right. It's just not accurate. It's not objective.
Well, it's a bad way of trying to discern the facts or the
well,
evidence.
Yeah.
You know, you can't. You can, but you're not going to come to a good conclusion if you're always trying to sift the evidence through your particular sieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, we all have that sieve, but the goal of the scholar is to try to acknowledge it and take that bias as much as you can as a person, and set it aside and try to look at the things.
If your sieve is purely objective and true,
right.
capital T, truth, if you will, that's fine. But you better make darn sure that all your stuff that you think is true isn't something that's constructed historically, or that it actually is true. That is, it comes from God's revelation. And I don't think God really has given us a template through which we view all of human history.
No.
I mean, God has revealed himself in certain propositional terms, but it's not as far-reaching and totalizing as perhaps, if we can pick on the Reform a bit, might treat it, or on the other side of the coin, like the Islamists might treat it, or the ideological atheists might treat their particular lens that they have from science, if you will.
So Islam and the Reformation, I mean, this is a big deal. This is really, I think we did this last time with Luther and Islam. We talked about the Augsburg Confession, and we like to discuss the history of the Augsburg Confession theologically, like blindly theologically. And really, more than anything, they got together because they needed some help.
Yeah, go back and read the Augsburg Confession. I'm not saying you, but our listeners, go back, read the Augsburg Confession, the introduction. The first two sentences will tell you exactly what the occasion was. To talk about, to have if you will, a conference, an imperial meeting, so that Europeans could possibly settle their theological differences, the differences that the Reformation had brought to the table, so that, for the sake of unity against the hereditary and ancient enemy of Christendom, as Melanchthon put it, as he was quoting Charles V's summons, so that they might come together for unity to oppose this ancient and hereditary foe. Now that's 1530. Just less than a year prior, 1529, the Ottoman Turks, again out of Istanbul, the premier Sunni, that is Orthodox Muslim empire since the middle of the 15th century, is banging on the eastern gates of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, that is at the city of Vienna. And in 1529, in the fall of 1529, in late August into September, and I believe into early October, if memory serves me correctly, it looked like to the people in the city of Vienna that the Turks were going to win that battle. As it turns out, they didn't. They decide, I believe this is in September or October of 1529, the Turks decide one night that they've been there too long, they're running out of supplies, they're going to turn back, go back to Istanbul, regroup, resupply, and come back to Vienna to fight another day. And they leave in the middle of the night. It's interesting, we don't have a whole lot of primary source eyewitness accounts of the event. There is one written by an obscure figure named Peter Stern, who talks about in the middle of the night in 1529 in Vienna, the people in Vienna are thinking about surrendering. And as they're doing this, because they're pretty sure they're going to lose, they've just been choked. No supplies, no food, nothing coming into the city. And so as they're thinking about this and tossing around ideas, they hear outside the walls screams and a lot of noise. They don't know what it is because it's dark. They wake up the next morning, and Peter Stern tells us the Ottoman camp was completely empty, but the field was littered with about 30,000 headless corpses of Christian prisoners of war.
Wow.
And the Turks had gone back to Istanbul or somewhere in Eastern Europe. And Stern praises God that they left, but suggests, as does Luther around the same time, let's not rest on our laurels now because they've left, because they will be back. And if they take that city, it's a gate or a key to the empire. In other words, if they take Vienna, the rest of Western Europe will follow suit. Luther, in his second introduction to the book of Daniel, written in the early 1540s, says something to the effect that if events continue to go the way they're going, demographically, politically, and territorially, and so on, he goes, it looks like the world will go Mohammedan. So it's not just Luther and some people who are writing, but your common people like a Peter Stern. It's the military. It's the people on the ground, on the front lines, who see this as not almost, but as an apocalyptic battle. Luther sees it as, and as do others, Lutheran reformers, and certainly a lot of Anabaptists see this as an apocalyptic, if not an eschatological struggle. Daniel 7, Luther was convinced. Daniel 7, where these four great beasts in succession come out of the sea. The fourth has 10 horns on his head, and there's a little horn that pops up and displaces 3. Luther says that little horn that's popped up on that beast's head is the Ottoman Empire. And this signals that the Ottoman Empire are the last great kingdom, if you will, to fight against the church. But eventually the time will run out and the end will come. The Ancient of Days will return, and so on and so forth. So this is huge in terms of worldview, in terms of like how people view the day that they're living in. It's huge for people living in the eastern parts of Germany because Christians are routinely, especially soldiers, are routinely being taken as prisoners of war. Some of them are executed, as in the case of Vienna. Others are taken back to Istanbul or other major cities in Eastern Europe and sold in slave markets and are forced to work for Ottoman Turks. Lots of reports from early forms of newspapers in the early 16th century were coming into Germany reporting that Christians, when they're stuck in the Ottoman Empire, servants or slaves of the Turks, they because it makes life much easier for them, they convert to Islam. So Luther and others have this great concern that a lot of Christians are becoming Muslims over in the East, and so it's apocalyptic, eschatological, missiological, apologetic, theological. Yeah. It's huge, and looking back at it from a historian's perspective today, you could say the interesting thing about all is that if it wasn't for the attention and the distraction that the Ottoman Turks and Islam provided in the period of the Reformation, probably Luther would have endured the same fate as a guy Jan Hus.
Right.
It was in the 15th century.
Czechoslovakian, right?
Yeah, from University of Prague, executed at the Council of Constance for heresy, for teaching many of the things that Luther would teach a century prior. Luther at one point even calls himself, early in his trial for heresy, a Hussite.
Yeah.
So Luther should have been, when he stood at the Diet of Worms and said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Burned. He was signing, a metaphorical way, his own death warrant. That's why that Luther movie before the one that's just coming out now, with I think it's Joseph Fiennes, where he's at Worms and he's shaking and it looks like he's like just having a nervous breakdown. I'm pretty sure that got Luther right there at Worms, because he knew exactly what was going to happen to him, most likely.
Well, he lived the rest of his life under the threat of death.
Yeah, and when
from 1521, he dies in 1546.
Yeah, he goes to the Wartburg when he's in that kind of kidnapping incident orchestrated by his friends and his elector. His elector, Frederick the Wise, did not want him to come out of the Wartburg.
No, wanted him to stay.
But Luther comes out a little more than a year later in 1522, 1523. And for the rest of his time, Luther, when he left, the town of Wittenberg, even if it's in electoral Saxony, his elector was very nervous.
Right.
Luther didn't give. That's the thing with Luther. He didn't give a rat's behind.
Yeah.
About his own life. I mean, he's a real mensch. He's obviously really believed in what he taught, and thought that even if it meant that his life might be taken, it was the cause, if you will, the gospel, was worth the cost that it might the personal cost to him. So. Anyway, we probably should get back. I'm sorry. We should have.
No, that's good. I think we're at our time here to take our break, and what we'll do after that is we'll come back and maybe just lay into some more of the specifics as to what do we need to know. What does the listener need to know about the Reformation and the Reformers' response to Islam, and maybe Islam's response back.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay,
sounds good.
Hello and welcome to our break. This is Thinking Fellows Podcast, and you are at our break here, and we'll be talking on our break about the Here We Still Stand conference. It's a conference sponsored by 1517, the Legacy Project. It's a Reformation celebration. It's going on this October 19 through 21. We're holding it to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. It'll be hosted at the luxurious Hyatt Regency Mission Bay Spa and Marina in San Diego, California. I've got a cough. Sorry. We've been talking about this off and on. The show we're doing today is a bit of a preview of that, when Adam's going through the Reformation and Islam, what's going on with those two things happening, movements really happening around the same time or gaining momentum at the same time. But there's many other speakers at this conference. You'll have Rod Rosenblatt, Matt Popovits, Jared Wilson, Elise Fitzpatrick, David Zoll, Stephen Paulson. I'll be there. Daniel Price, Steve Brown, Dr. Montgomery will be there. Chad Bird, Chris Roseborough, Dr. Daniel Van Voris, Dr. Jeff Mallinson, Uva Simonetto, Donovan Riley, Jessica Thompson, R.J. Grunwald, Eric Sorensen, and I don't know how you ended up last on the list, but last but not least is Dr. Adam Francis.
That's where I stand, I guess.
I don't think so. That's a great
fine.
picture of you, though, I have to say. The bow tie and all.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, it's odd.
Can I just say something?
Amazing.
I guess there are pictures of me somewhere on the internet, and so when I go places, people, I guess cut and paste.
Yeah. Happens to me all the time, too.
And I have no idea this is like a picture taken in the backyard at some point.
Yeah.
I have no idea how it gets
Facebook, baby.
But I was off Facebook and it's, maybe.
Doesn't mean your pictures are off Facebook.
Oh.
Facebook
whatever.
Owns you. Don't you know that? So the schedule, again, it's October 19 will be the podcast pre-conference. Will be happening all day that day. At 11:30 a.m. You can sit in on recordings of Ringside with the Jagged Word guys. 12:30, 40 minutes in the Old Testament. 1:30, Front Porch with the Fitzes. 2:30, Virtue in the Wasteland. 3:30, our very own Thinking Fellows. You can sit in on a podcast with us. But then that afternoon, the conference really starts out. You have Steve Brown that afternoon coming in. And then starting on Friday, the various speakers will be going through the texts, the scriptural texts that are associated closely with the Reformation. Texts like 2 Corinthians 5, 16 through 21, and Galatians 3, 10 through 14. There'll be presentations on Martin Luther, presentations on Philip Melanchthon, presentations especially one by Dr. Montgomery on why the Reformation really mattered. You really need to check this out. Every time I look it over, I am amazed at the cost is $199. It's held in a beautiful venue in San Diego, and your ticket price includes the general conference talks, breakout talks. We're doing a hymn sing at Grace Lutheran Church in San Diego, and we're providing transportation via shuttle back and forth from the hymn sing. You get meals, 2 breakfasts, 1 lunch, 1 plated dinner, and 1 dessert buffet. It's really an incredible deal. You need to go over to herewestillstand.org, herewestillstand.org, and check it out. Again, a Reformation conference happening October 19 through 21 in beautiful San Diego, California. Check it out at herewestillstand.org. All right, we're back, Adam. We need to know, what do we need to know about what's going on with Islam during the Reformation and what the Reformers are saying in response to it?
Well, there's a lot.
There's a lot.
Maybe going back a bit to this idea of the Ottoman Empire and Islam moving into Europe and how everybody perceives it as obviously a real challenge, a real threat. One of the early works addressing it as a political, military, religious threat was written by Martin Luther in 1529, called "On War Against the Turk."
Right.
And that's been available in English translation for some time. It's in the American edition of Luther's works, I think volume 46. It's a real interesting read because it kind of encapsulates at least the Lutheran reformers' view of Islam, and maybe I'd say by extension the conservative Reformation view of Islam. So that would include like the Calvinist stream when it comes along a little later on,
but not like the Anabaptists.
Not the Anabaptists. There's a marked divide in how Europeans should respond to the extension of Islam. In the journal Muslim World, I just wrote an article for them on this, and what you see is there's basically three types of responses, or three suggested responses to Islam on the political, military level. The early response is the age-old response that the Catholic Church had been using for centuries at this point, and that is the crusade. In fact, even before Luther's 95 Theses, he's asked by his elector's secretary, at that time George Spalatin, what he thinks about, and if he could justify a crusade or a holy war, if you will, against the Ottoman Turks. And this is like 1516 or early 1517. And because the Pope Leo the X is planning on going to war with them under the guise of a crusade. The Fourth Lateran Council had, from like 1512 to 1515 or 1516, had decided that they were going to raise part of their ties to the church would go to funding the crusade. It was a done deal, and so in 1516, everybody's planning for, all the secular and also the church officials are planning on going to war against the Ottomans under the leadership of, or at least the blessing of the Pope. And Luther's asked, can this be justified? And Luther says it can't be justified biblically. This is before, again, the Protestant Reformation is starting to even take off. It's not even an idea yet.
Yeah.
And it can't be justified biblically. And he says, moreover, fighting against the Turks will be of no benefit to us, because ultimately we got to fight against our own Turks within. And what he meant by that is there's enough problems in Christendom that need to be cleaned up before we even think about how we're going to address the challenge that the Ottoman Empire and Islam provides. Because for him, they're still far afield. They're still back in Istanbul. They haven't crossed the Danube River yet. They're not even into Hungary yet. So for Luther, the crusade was a distraction that he suggested maybe the church was providing, so that people, there's been for a century prior a lot of focus on a lot of corruption within the church.
Right,
so we got to fix the corruption.
A lot of focus on the
church.
moral corruption,
sure.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So it's very early on. Luther's interested in, or being advised or asked to provide advice for how to deal with Islam. Should we deal with it in the traditional way through crusade? And he says no. But then he goes silent for a long time because he's got other fish to fry. He's got the 95 Theses to write. He's got his trial for heresy. He's translating, probably the most important thing, translating the Bible into German.
So it's important to note at this time that this is Luther, the biblical scholar, saying you can't make a scriptural case for doing this.
Right. Yeah. And this
is not yet Luther the Reformer.
Right. But that's interesting that you bring that up, because he's probably, I doubt he's the first, but he's probably the first most influential theologian to argue completely against the crusade being a thing that can be justified by Christians. You have people who criticize the crusades all the way back to the 12th century, but their criticism isn't that this is unbiblical or anything like that. It's mostly, it's fine to go expand the reach of Christendom, to liberate the Holy Land and fight Islam and so on, but there should be an additional missionary component added on to it.
Oh, gotcha.
But with Luther, crusade is completely unjustified biblically.
On the basis of Scripture, yeah.
On the basis of Scripture. War is not something the church is involved in.
Left-hand kingdom.
It's purely a secular, political, civil matter.
Right.
So that's very early on.
Yeah, so to tie this into some of the the series we've been in is that you see a very early influence making sort of an eruption in Luther, even before he's considered a reformer, of this idea of if we believe something or teach something, we need to base it on Scripture.
Yeah. Yep.
Or do something.
Yeah.
It needs to be as the church, it needs to be based on what Scripture says, and probably Scripture alone.
Yeah, and he learned that from down in Erfurt,
right,
from his teachers down there, who were not sola scriptura people, but they placed their primary authority, their formal principle was not in practice, but theoretically Scripture.
Gotcha.
In practice, the church was just too powerful, too much.
Yeah.
You didn't go against the church, but there is a sense that in his teachers were mostly nominalist teachers, and in nominalism there is a sense that when it comes to theological matters, it's not. Church tradition doesn't have the weight of authority. The Scriptures have the weight of authority. Now, that's in theory. That's how they theorize that. But in practice, the church still exerts tremendous amount of authority in tradition. Anyway, so getting back to when Luther's advised about or asked for advice on the crusade, he says it just can't be justified. We should deal with our own problems within. Don't worry so much about this external threat that's afar off. So about a decade later, though, the Turks are in Hungary. 1526, the famous Battle of Mohacs, where King Louis is killed, is sort of like signals that the Ottoman Turks aren't just making little forays into just east of Germany, but they're there trying to consolidate their control of Hungary. And 1526, they take Mohacs. Shortly thereafter, they take Buda and Pest on either side of the Danube River, and they convert the cathedral there, Templis Macedum, into a mosque, which is a sign. Everybody treats that as a sign that and they're right, that the Ottomans are doing this to show that Islam is there now to stay.
Gotcha.
So then it's on the radar screen again for Luther, and we have to talk about Luther at this point in terms of the Reformation of Islam, because it's still very early on.
Yeah.
And that 2.5 years later, they're outside. The Turks are at Vienna, and that's when it becomes. Then all of a sudden, Luther and everybody else, it's permanently on their radar. So Luther writes on war against the Turk, comes out against strongly, much stronger than his early suggestion that the Crusades can't be justified biblically, but in a full theological treatise, strongly against the Crusades. Even says that absolutely we must defend ourselves against the Turks, but only under the justification of just war, that this is ultimately a defensive war. That doesn't mean you can't fight offensively, you can't fight preemptively, but that this is a war that the Turks, that Islam has started, and they do not intend to stop, and so we've got to put a stop to it. So he absolutely justifies a war of defense for the sake of the neighbor, for Christendom. He says that the only people who can lead such a war are secular officials. If you see a bishop in the field leading troops, justifying the war, even if he's carrying a banner with a crucifix on it, he says, run from that as if it's the devil.
Wow.
That's pretty
bold, strong, yeah.
And to think about this in broader context, it just popped in my mind. Around the same time, Erasmus is writing a work entitled also on war against the Turk, where he argues essentially the same point, that the Turks must be fought, but only under the pretense of a just war. So
Yeah, that gets to be a fun conversation because in many ways Erasmus is a reformer himself. He's
moral reformer.
He's looking for a moral reform of the church, but he's not satisfied with the status quo of the church or of the state of Christianity in his time, much like Luther.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's different.
They get set against each other, and they well should, because Luther's reform is expressly theological,
right?
And the bondage of the will. Luther identifies the big differences between he and Erasmus, pretty explicitly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it's helpful historically to point out that there are other people, even people who remain in the church, who do not agree with many of the moves that the church is making. And this is just one illustration of it.
Yeah, a bit of bibliography. I've mentioned it several times in this series on the Reformation. Scott Hendrick's book, new book, 2015 on Martin Luther, does a great job of describing Luther's friendships and acquaintances with people who, like Johann Staupitz, his father confessor when he was a monk in the Augustinian order. Staupitz pushes Luther to Christ on the cross, right? When Luther has all this Anfechtung, this anxiety about whether he's saved or not, and so on. And Staupitz, if I'm not mistaken, forever remains a monk,
right?
But if you will, an evangelical monk,
right?
And did attempt like small little reforms in his monastic house,
which he would have had some control to do.
Yeah, which was very normal for abbots or the monastic leaders within monasticism. But he doesn't do it on the scale that he's not doing it on the scale that Luther did. So there's and in terms of the Reformation being a much broader thing than just Luther and the Lutheran Reformation, you could even historically there are cries for reform within the church going back to the 14th century. So, it's of course Luther should get pride of place because he's the guy who's the first successful major reformer. But it's a much broader, historically speaking, much broader movement.
I like to always point out too that let's just use Erasmus again. You could use Johann Reuchlin too. You could use several other characters who, even though I don't think they ended up liking this reality, but they played a support role in the Lutheran Reformation in many ways. I mean, they opened doors that were not previously opened.
Sure.
And just sort of following the theme of this show, I think it's important to point that kind of thing out so that people see that there's historical movements going on here, and there are other historical figures that we sometimes, because of our theology, vilify, and theologically perhaps they need to be vilified.
Sure.
But they open some doors here that when we say Luther was the first successful one, you can, in a lot of ways, you can say that because of his reliance and his ability to access a critical edition of the Greek New Testament and
printing press. Northern Germany.
He's translating the Bible into the language of the people, and the movement to study for theologians and humanists to study Hebrew comes along through people like Johann Reuchlin, and these things happen, and these guys stayed in the church and sometimes wrote against him.
Yeah, and you need to so the greatest Reformation historians. Let me backtrack a bit. There has been a long-standing debate within Reformation historiography. Those historians who write on the Reformation is the Reformation an early modern movement? Is it sort of like a movement that purposely is moving away from the Middle Ages, or is it a movement of the late Middle Ages?
Yeah.
And Heiko Obermann, Stephen Osment, and people from that school have argued that it's a late medieval movement. It gives birth to the modernity in a way, or plants the seeds perhaps. But if you're going to understand the Reformation, the causes, the causes and the influences and the roots of it, you've got to go back to the late Middle Ages, because there are tons and tons of people trying to reform. So,
where do you fall on that?
I think definitely a late medieval movement. Okay. You have to. I mean, it's weird it's not weird. It's when people wanted to brand Luther a heretic in his day and age, they usually called him like a Marsilian.
Right.
Or they'll say if Nicholas of Lyre didn't play his lyre, there would have been no Luther. He's so Marsilius is a political thinker, wrote The Defender of the Peace, Nicholas O'Lyra, an Old Testament exegete. There are all these late medieval people that people in Luther's own day and age recognize that these people heavily influenced Luther. They kind of they're the seeds for Luther's reform. Now, did Luther acknowledge that? In a way, he did. He recognized that he wasn't, Luther, if there's one thing about Luther, I think we talked about this last episode, he was not interested in being an innovator.
No.
He wasn't being edgy or anything like that for the sake of being sexy, or he was wanting to conserve biblical doctrine first and foremost, and to retain the great tradition of the church so long as it could be justified or it was useful. Holy Scripture. Yeah. And that's it. Yeah. So he there's a good reason why there. Oh boy. For some reason, the name is escaping me, but the book, the Conservative Reformation and its Theology.
Charles Porterfield
Crowell. Why he calls the Lutheran Reformation the Conservative Reformation, because it's deeply conservative. They saw themselves, they didn't use this term, but they were in many ways, and I don't know if I like this term, at least the connotations of it today, but they were evangelical Catholics. Biblical Catholics, if you will, or at least that's maybe how they would have saw themselves. Somewhere along the line, though, they recognized that, as Luther put it, the church itself, the Catholic Church, had given Luther and these evangelical Catholics a bill of divorce, and that's where the real divide is.
Right.
And so they go their own way, but they're not chucking tradition for the sake of chucking tradition.
No.
So anyway, back to the Islam.
That was a good little tangent, though.
I think we have about 10 minutes, I think.
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
At Vienna, and Luther and Erasmus is on war against the Turks, the rejection of the crusade. In Luther's on war against the Turk, he has just a little bit right in the middle on Islam. And he says that, of course, the Turks pose a problem concern like national security, we might say today, to Germany. Physical security of Germany. Of course, they pose that challenge. But they also pose a tremendous challenge to the, if you will, social and religious and political fabric of Western Europe. And he says that in nature, in societies, there are basically three estates. There are three spheres of life. There's the religious, there's the political, and there's the domestic realm, if you will. And he says, if those estates aren't stable, civilization crumbles. And he says, Islam poses a challenge to all three of those estates. To the political estate, Islam is expansionistic, imperialistic. It's warmongering. To the domestic or the marital estate, he says it poses a challenge to the basic fundamental union in that estate, that is the holy matrimony, in that Islam permits up to 4 wives, or permits polygamy. And in the religious estate, obviously it poses a challenge because it dethrones Jesus and places Muhammad in his place. So for Luther, it poses a theological challenge, obviously, but it's more of a civilizational challenge, if you will. For him, though he doesn't use this terminology, this is the way he sees it, Islam overturns at least the Western social, political ideal.
If you believe that society is held in place by sort of these three estates, the political, the religious, and the domestic, or the home life, right?
And these estates aren't just sort of like ambiguous things. They have real content. And let me just, one more thing to add. Luther doesn't just critique Islam for the problems it poses to these estates. He also, while he's doing that, says things aren't so hot here in Western Europe either. It's messed up here. Right. But at least the basic structure is there.
Yeah. We're still getting married. We're still having babies. We still can have a conversation because of the way our governance happens with the Holy Roman Empire regarding whether or not we're all going to go to war or not.
Right.
The religious estate is messed up, but it's still, quote unquote, functioning-ish.
Yeah. Superficially, it's
right.
Yeah.
But this could topple it all. And I mean, I think it's interesting. I think our listeners should really hone in on maybe many of them do believe that, the idea of the three states, but just hone in on the idea of what if you really believed that, right? And you saw these Turkish hordes coming, and it's not only that they might kill you physically, but even if you survive this, that your world as you know it, in that these three estates will at least be dramatically altered, if not abolished in the way that you see them. Your world as you know it is over.
Yes, and that's an excellent point, a great segue into another thing we see in at least the Lutheran side of things. They start considering, Luther and Eustace Jonas and Philip Melanchthon and all his other friends start considering right around the time of the Battle of Vienna what it might mean for Christians if they are taken captive and sent into the Ottoman world, or the Ottoman Empire engulfs them.
What do you do if you find yourself captive in Turkish land? And
soon, Concordia Publishing House will be putting out a volume of Luther's works that will have a translation of Luther's Muster Sermon Against the Turk, which is late 1529, 1530, two different versions of it. It's got two parts. One is Luther's eschatological appraisal of the Turks. It's interesting, very interesting. More interesting, I think, is the second part where Luther asks the question, so what does this mean for the Christian? The Christian under what he calls the Mohammedan Empire. And Luther says, it means God has a different plan for you. No, that's not his exact phrase, but this is what God has for you. If you are stuck in the midst of Islam, Luther says, this is what God has for you, and you've got to make do, but you got to know some things about living under Islam. You're not going to have access, probably, to evangelical books, probably not a pastor, so you're going to have to make do on your own. So while you're free now, memorize the Our Father, the Ten Commandments, basically learn your catechism. He's writing the catechism right about this time. Learn the basic components of Christian doctrine. When you're there as a Christian, he says, serve your Turkish masters faithfully.
Totally in line with what we would say is the doctrine of vocation.
Yeah. They're your new masters. They're your secular leaders. Serve them. Yeah. You consider yourself a servant of the Turk. In that context, though, Luther goes on. This is the thing that's really remarkable. If you think about his nasty comments about the other, like Jews and Turks, you can call the Turks incarnate devils and so on. He says, if in that context, if the opportunity arises for you to defend the gospel or to proclaim the gospel, do it. And here's how. And he offers some advice on how to think about defending Christianity over and against Islam. And so real kind of it's not like the strongest apologetic, but he has a kind of an existential apologetic, so Christians might know how to address the theological assertions of Islam. So
that's true. Who did the translation?
I edited it. I can't remember the guy's name.
So you've looked through it. You're excited about it.
I get all the footnotes and.
Yeah, that's good.
I was spent when I did all these translations. Then they gave me that, and I said, "Yeah, give it to somebody else." Anyway, can I? Before our time's up, one more thing just to broaden it out. So for Luther, the Lutheran reformers, knowing about Islam was essential in case you're engulfed by it. And it's this. So in the 1540s, there was a move to make Christians, even your common Christian, aware of Islam and the challenges they'll face under Islam. And that culminates in this publication of the Quran in 1543. And the story here is fascinating. I'll try to make it as quickly as possible. So an old 1142 a translation of the Quran into Latin was discovered. It's edited by this guy, this Swiss reformer, Theodor Bibliander. Going to press in Basel, the publisher's arrested. Luther writes a letter to the city council of Basel and says, hey, if you don't publish it in Basel, we're going to publish it in Wittenberg, so you might as well just publish it. And he says, if Christians are to be lion-hearted in the defense of the gospel, that's a direct quote, over and against the Turk, they've got to know what Islam teaches, so they have to have access to the Quran. And so we don't have the minutes to the meetings at the City Council of Basel, but it was after Luther's letter is received that they release the publisher, and the Quran is published for the first time in Latin, or in the vernacular, in all of its history, but not published alone. It's preceded by a preface to the Quran that Luther wrote, where Luther addresses especially teachers in the church, pastors and teachers and so on, and says, you especially need to read this so that you're aware of it, so you can teach the common people. But he says, anybody who wants to read the Quran shouldn't be afraid that they're going to become a Muslim. This book is filled with so many lies. It's so painfully, obviously heretical.
Yeah, erroneous.
And then you got the Quran, but then you've got all these other Islamic sources that are translated into Latin, then histories of the Ottoman Turks especially, and then a bunch of old polemical and apologetic material that medieval Christians wrote against Islam, some in Latin, others in other translations, published in one massive volume. I don't remember how many pages, but it's a huge, probably like 6-inch thick tome. And one contemporary scholars have called that the first encyclopedia of Islam, and it has a preface written by a reformer named Martin Luther.
That's amazing.
That's fascinating. And so that's published, and that becomes and Luther's the guy in many ways behind the publication of this thing, not directly, but his support of it. And that becomes sort of the primary text for missionaries, Jesuit missionaries, for example, going to India and other places in centuries that follow. And certainly Protestant missionaries as the Protestant missionary movement starts gaining momentum too. So the legacy of the Reformation in Islam is that the Reformation, with the exception of those radical Anabaptists who see the Islam as not really a big challenge, in fact, they see them as kind of Christians, anonymous Christians, if you will, is that the Reformation takes Islam and its challenge to not just Christian theology, but, if you will, Christian society, think, late Middle Ages, early modern period, very seriously on multiple levels. It's not just, Islam has Jesus and the Trinity wrong.
Right.
This poses a challenge to our
threat to our way of life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is that preface to the Quran that Luther wrote translated?
It is an old translation in the journal Word and World. You probably get it. I'm sure you can get it online. But there is I translated a new in the American edition of Luther's works. So
okay.
That's there. And everything that Luther wrote on Islam now is translated into English.
Oh, good.
In the last couple of years.
Awesome. All right. Thanks for being with us. A great show, Adam. Thanks for sharing your plethora of knowledge concerning Islam with us one more time. We won't see you. You'll hear us next time. Have a good time until then.